perception, and Michael, thank you for those very kind words. Let me just respond right away to something you said a moment ago. Did anyone predict what was going to happen in the 80s beforehand? Well, the answer to the question is, I think I know all of the people who did, personally. I may be wrong, obviously, but Brian Crozier told me in the early 80s that communism would collapse within a few years. He said by the end of this decade. He subsequently forgot he'd said this, and when I told him, he was amazed that he had chosen. Robert Conquest, the great Sovietologist who's up in Northern California at Hoover, he made a similar prediction, though he didn't quite set a date on it. And I was lucky enough to meet, before his accidental death, Andrei Amaury, who wrote the famous book, Will the Soviet Union Last Until 1984? Well, it lasted only a little bit beyond 1984, but when that book came out, of course, people just dismissed as absurd the idea that such a powerful, well-established state would disappear. In preparing my own book, I did exactly what you were, so to speak, suggesting. I tried to find books that forecast the future of this way. And of course, quite a number of such books were written, but they were almost all wrong. I mean, they got it very badly wrong. And for good reasons, which is to say that if you were writing in the 1970s and you looked across at all the international developments taking place, they were very discouraging from the standpoint of free Western society. All of the trends seemed to be going in the wrong direction. And that was very significant. Now, I'll briefly pause a moment and say I want to thank you for what you said. I want to also thank David Horowitz and the Society for inviting me. And I hope you'll give him my best wishes. I admire enormously what he's done. And of course, I'm greatly relieved that he and Peter Collier switched sides, because I don't know any two braver people in the world, and it's good that whether they're on our side or not against us. And finally, I'd like to thank Hugh Hewitt, who I take it is responsible for some of you being here because of yesterday's broadcast, which I should also say sent my book rocketing up the Amazon charts today. so I have another good reason. Now, just to go back to your point, what happened in the 80s? One final request. I'm quite capable of rambling on endlessly, if not actually physically stopped. So I want you to tell me when the 20 minutes is up, and I'll try to bring my remarks to a close. Probably in another 20 minutes. But when we look at the 1980s the 1970s, and we see all of the trends, all of the things that were going wrong, the rise of terrorism. Modern terrorism really begins in 1970 with the hijacking of the planes and their destruction in Dawson's Field. Of course, it gets worse, but quite quickly with the murder of the Munich athletes, and it goes on getting worse because the European governments, even when they manage to capture the terrorists, generally release them after a relatively short time in response to further terrorist pressure. That was one thing. There was the catastrophic quadrupling of oil prices in a single day by OPEC, which led to the spread across the world, first of all, of economic stagnation, slowdown in growth, rising unemployment, and secondly, inflation. So that you had, by the end of the decade, something that previously economists never thought could possibly exist, something called stagflation, which was a combination of rising unemployment and rising prices simultaneously. And that undermined confidence enormously throughout the world. You had the advance of the Soviet Union, which you gave wonderful examples of what it was like at the sharp end. But if you stood back and looked at what was happening in the world, the Soviet Union made enormous advances. It installed the SS-20 missiles in Western Europe. It developed, for the first time really, a world-class Soviet fleet which began shadowing American ships in the Mediterranean. The Red Army itself was a powerful force compared to NATO forces, and Raymond Aron, the great French philosopher, said at the time, there is a spectre haunting Europe, the spectre of the Red Army. It was also, the Red Army was, the Soviets were also advancing in the Third World, as close to America as Nicaragua and El Salvador. They were ferrying Cuban troops to 17 African countries to support friendly regimes there and to get rid of unfriendly ones. And in general, the Soviets seemed to be on the march, they and their Third World allies. That was partly in response to perceived American weakness. If you remember at that time, the collapse of Vietnam began to spread the sense that America was no longer the great power it had once seemed. It had all the guns and the ships, but it wasn't able to use them. And then, of course, this seemed to be dramatically confirmed when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. There was little we could do about it, and still worse, our diplomats were seized as hostages in Tehran. Even worse than that, our attempt to rescue them failed disastrously. Let me tell you just one little story about that. Antonio Martino is a name some of you will know. He was the Italian defense minister until recently, and the previous the Italian foreign minister. At the time, he was a young professor of economics at Rome University, married to an American, former pupil of Milton Friedman, and known in American public life, in Italian public life, as a very strong friend of America. On the day that the fiasco of Desert One was announced, friends from the left rang him up and said, "I feel so sorry for you, Antonio. You must feel terrible about this. The Americans look such fools." And the reason why everybody felt that was such an important event was that whether or not you liked America, whether or not you approved of America, Americans had always struck Europeans as being technically competent. It was a kind of a myth that every American boy could open the hood of the car and fix the car if it went wrong. And here was a society that prided itself on its technical competence, being unable to mount a rescue operation. So all of these things came together to produce, it seems to me, the atmosphere of despair in the West as a whole, to which you alluded, and which, of course, Jimmy Carter himself effectively conceded when he made the famous speech. Never used the word, but the famous speech in which he said we were suffering from a malaise. Now, in a curious way, all this was a good thing, because it created the only circumstances in which figures like Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, and John Paul could come to power. They were wonderful people in many respects, but they were seen as too extreme. They were seen sometimes as slightly acerbic figures, Reagan less than the others, but you know, these were figures who might rub you up the wrong way. They'd say what they thought, whether or not you liked it. And they weren't the kind of figures who normally come to power in democracies. If you've got figures like that, it's when conditions are really desperate and people turn to strong figures whom they feel can cope. And that's what happened. And in each case, there was a particular reason they came to power. In the case of Ronald Reagan, it was, I think, the hostage crisis. And I mean, you all know about that, I won't talk about it. In the case of Margaret Thatcher, it was the near collapse of Britain when the unions across the country went on strike in the so-called Winter of Discontent, 4 months before the election. Now, I was covering that as a young British journalist at the time, and it was an extraordinary series of events. In my own town, hometown of Liverpool, the grave diggers went on strike, and they had to keep bodies in the fridge, in the refrigerator, until they went back to work. Striking ambulance drivers picketed hospitals and turned away heart patients who were in need of care. The rubbish piled up in the middle of London in Leicester Square, and I could give you another 10 examples. And that created the circumstances in which the British people turned to Mrs. Thatcher, because she, not only did she seem a strong figure, but these were the kind of things she had warned would happen if you didn't get legal control of the trade unions and begin to tackle inflation and other economic ills. In some ways, though, the most interesting crisis is that which brought the Pope to power. Power is not perhaps the right word for the papacy, in 1978. And that was the death of the previous Pope, Pope John Paul I. Now, he died after, you will remember, after only a month after being selected. So the cardinals got back from Rome, had hardly unpacked, they had to pack again and come back to the second conclave. At that conclave, the present Pope, Cardinal Ratzinger then, made a speech in which he said, you know, when we elected John Paul I, we thought we were doing the will of God. Plainly, God is telling us something here.